All right, man, peace. So when we left off in part one, we were just going over many of the dynamics that are being utilized by LeBron James and his corporate sponsors to try to cultivate a cult of personality for himself as this pseudo-racial leader, even though it's very apparent to me that he is a globalist. And of course, Stephen A. Smith, being a Boule Negro, was trying to take advantage of LeBron James speaking on the quote-unquote racial topic by himself, trying to put the onus on the Caucasian, which is the want of the pro-black, liberal black, and Boule Negro. They like to put the onus on the Caucasian to provide solutions for a problem that is only going to be solved by the so-called black man. So anyway, let's continue. Of course, they're going to talk about it, and I'm going to chime in.
All right, guys, so we heard from LeBron James earlier talking about the double standard in his new show, The Shop, on HBO. And Stephen A., you posed the question.
Let me say this. You'd be a fool to not acknowledge that there is a so-called double standard when certain situations are being evaluated comparatively between a Caucasian and a so-called black man. Of course, there is a quote-unquote double standard. But dare I say, LeBron James has ascended beyond that so-called double standard because he is on the quote-unquote Mount Rushmore of American athletes to the point where he's a global figure, he's a global brand. And to be quite frank with you, he should be the last person complaining about how he be treated by the Caucasian media because he's been feted for at the very least for the last 4+ years since he decided to return to Cleveland.
To both Max and Stephen A., how can white America respond to this? And Max, I want to let you do it because I don't want to misquote you. And
let me say this. Many pro-blackity blacks have come on my channel and accused me of quote-unquote trying to let white people off the hook. It's not about trying to let the Caucasian off the hook. It's about trying to extol the capabilities, the potential of the so-called black man to solve his own problems so that he does not have to give credit to the Caucasian when those problems get solved, because it does not behoove the so-called Caucasian to solve your problems for you, especially when they're reaping the benefits of your dysfunctionality, so-called black man. Please understand that, once again, it makes no sense for a prostitute to ask her pimp why he is pimping her. That is his job, to pimp her. If the so-called Caucasian is as big an oppressor as you assert that he is, what does he have to gain by empowering you? As Max Kellerman tried to allege in part one of the video that I did, he quoted Chris Rock by saying that what has changed is that so-called white people have gotten better, quote unquote. It's not that they've gotten better, it's that they've gotten weaker. Their empire has gotten weaker. So therefore, they have to appeal to other demographics within their empire to assist them in maintaining their rulership. Once again, brothers, we have to start to think with a ruling class mentality.
I want to let Will respond to the white privilege aspect that you brought up. So can you please reframe what you just said?
Well, simply that Will is, anyone who would say that Will's racist doesn't know him. He is not, clearly. I believe Will, and the reason we're talking...
I don't think that he's quote-unquote racist any more than you are, Max Kellerman. I think that you're both a couple of quote-unquote Caucasian males who've been raised in an environment that was created for you to do well, and that's what this environment is supposed to be. Whoever's in rulership is supposed to make sure that their sons and daughters are put in an advantageous position. It's just that Will Kane, he's not quite as well acquainted with skullduggery as you are. He's not quite as well acquainted with creating a facade for himself like you are. But I tell brothers this all the time. When I come across the Caucasian, I assume that they've been imbued with a certain level of racialism, if not outright racism. That's part of rulership. People adhere to certain stereotypes pertaining to all races. And so-called black people, they do it as well. We do it as well. We look at other races and we tend to put them into certain stereotypes. That's just part of the human condition. The human mind, it thinks associatively. It works in an associative manner. And to be quite frank with you, one of the main reasons why stereotypes oftentimes are applicable to a certain degree is because culture creates consistent behavior. So once again, the issue is with our quote-unquote culture, our pseudo-culture, more than the stereotypes that other races put us into. They're going to categorize us based off of what they expect from us. So if they expect very little, the stereotypes that surround so-called blacks is always going to revolve around a certain element of dysfunctionality. But we can solve our own problems. We don't need anybody else. I'm going to say it again. We can solve our own problems. We don't need anyone else.
We're talking is because you and I, we three are talking, and also because I think there is represented by that a large part of the population, white people, that feel I'm not racist. I don't participate aggressively in like white grievance politics, but.
Well, we know that you're going to try to refute any sentiment amongst the average so-called Caucasian that they're not racist by you saying that they've inherited a ruling class mentality. You're not going to say it like that, though. You're going to say that they've inherited white privilege. Once again, that's a part of rulership. And let me say this, and I've stated this in previous videos. The average so-called Caucasian in America did not own slaves. Or I should say, their ancestors did not own slaves. The vast majority of so-called Caucasians in America are the descendants of white trash. That's what they are. Now, do they reap the benefits of the overall rulership? Of course they do, but they're supposed to. Our people have allowed the liberal Caucasian to make us think that we should walk towards every so-called Caucasian with our hands out and tell them what they owe us. It's really about what we owe ourselves. What we owe ourselves is to give ourselves an adequate opportunity, at the very least, an adequate opportunity to compete, and compete to win. Not compete to be equal, but to compete to win.
But the problem, as Martin Luther King pointed out about the white moderate, is in this case, if you take it to today, is that white people are not always sensitive to white privilege and what that confers and what it means.
Well, the real question is, how sensitive should we expect them to be? For example, there are atrocities that are occurring in the land of Israel, aka Palestine, right now. How sensitive should the average so-called black person be towards what the Palestinians are going through right now? How compassionate should we be expected to be towards the plight of others if we're not living as them? Now, certain people may say, well, bro, you really can't compare that because here in this country, we've been dealing with the Caucasians' issues for 400 years. Yes, according to the official slave narrative, yes. According to the official slave narrative. But in all reality, so-called chattel slavery or chattel slavery was not something that was racially oriented until the late 1700s, going into the 1800s. Chattel slavery was not something that was white on black in the 1600s and early 1700s. That's just what the textbooks tell you so that they can once again imbue that ruling class mentality into the Caucasian and once again reinforce the slave mind and the inferiority complex into so-called black people.
And so, Will, the floor is yours.
Okay, and just to reframe the question quickly, Stephen A., you present to me and Max, what can white America do about the situation Lebron illustrates for us? That black athletes and white athletes are treated differently. Fair, Stephen?
Yeah, and why do you both believe that there are white folks who still harbor the kind of feelings towards the black athlete and black people overall that LeBron James articulated?
Okay, fair.
Why is it their responsibility to explain the mindset of other Caucasian people if, as you've already stated, we cannot expect them to speak from the mindset of a quote-unquote racist if they're not racist? You guys just finished claiming that you don't believe that Will Cain is racist, but you want him to speak from the perspective of a quote-unquote oppressive Caucasian person. The scenario that you're laying out for him does not make sense.
So I'll take it this way. First of all, Max, you describe me, and I don't take any offense at it. I just think it's inaccurate. You describe me as a white moderate. You use Martin Luther King's very eloquent quote to show the symptom of people who do not appreciate the concept of white privilege. You suggest and you offer, and I appreciate that I'm not dealing in white grievance politics, certainly not racism, but perhaps lacking in...
Right, but Max Kellerman is dealing in white guilt policies, the white guilt agenda, which normally is put forth by the Caucasian superliberal Jew. That's why I stated that behind Martin Luther King was a Caucasian superliberal Jew. As a matter of fact, more than one. And I'm sure that Max Kellerman is aware of this. I'm sure that if you were to mention the name Stanley Levinson to Max Kellerman, he would know who that person was. Let me rewind this back just a little bit.
Moderate. Use Martin Luther King's very eloquent quote to show the symptom of people who do not appreciate the concept of white privilege. You suggest and you offer, and I appreciate that I'm not dealing in white grievance politics, certainly not racism, but perhaps lacking in empathy or action on some issues that require justice. I think that's what and how you have
At
described
times,
me.
yes, I feel that way, yes,
Okay.
in our debates. Yep.
Here's how I would describe myself, Max. I don't speak for anything white. I don't speak for anything racial. I don't speak for any of my superficial, on-the-surface characteristics. I speak as someone who is an individualist.
Well, good for you if that actually is your platform. But we all know that people are tribal by nature. So for you to expect anyone with any proper level of cognitive function to believe that you have no level of quote unquote tribalism, I think that that's you being disingenuous. But let me say this. I think that you have not done a good enough job in calling out Mr. Max Kellerman, because it's very obvious that he was trying to guilt you into aligning yourself with the Marxist agenda of Mr. Colin Kaepernick and the woke aspect of the NFL, who in all reality are more concerned with the fact that they don't have fully guaranteed contracts than they are any form of so-called racial justice. That's why even Michael Bennett, that nut job, recently came out and stated that it's time for us to stop kneeling. It's time for us to go to the next phase of the quote-unquote plan. The problem is that there is no plan. And that's my point. Once again, Max Kellerman, being the super liberal Caucasian Jew, is an advocate for chaos and the perpetuation of chaos. Because what does that do? That allows him to be the only one with any level of insight while everyone else is delving into the darkness. That's why he's so much behind LeBron James, because LeBron James is another pawn of the Hegelian dialectic faction that is backing him. Nike and other Marxist sponsors, etc.
I don't accident into this position. I am not lacking in awareness and arriving at this position. I don't live, despite what people might want to assume about me, in a white bubble and don't expose myself to other parts of this world and other cultures and races. It's not who I am. I got here, where I am, by design. I believe in...
Hey, brothers, did you hear that? Did you hear what Will Kane just stated? That should be the mentality of every so-called black man when you get somewhere. It shouldn't be that you're made to feel like you're in a certain environment because they gave you a handout. And that's really what he's trying to say in a tacit way. He's trying to let Max Kellerman know that you're trying to make black people believe that they should have their handout to the average Caucasian. Because Max Kellerman would not accept you coming to him with a handout. But he wants you to believe that you should be going to the average Caucasian with a handout. And the average Caucasian is not going to give you a handout. I wonder why nobody ever asked Max Kellerman about what he thinks pertaining to the issue that is occurring over in Israel between the Israelis or the Caucasian Jews that live there and the Palestinians. And how come they're not as understanding towards the Palestinians as many of the American super liberal Caucasian Jews expect the average Caucasian to be with the average so-called Negro or person of color? How come those same dynamics don't apply over in Israel? Very interesting.
individualism. I reject concepts like white America and black America. I reject concepts like black Twitter. I reject anything that defines us according to groups on superficial characteristics. I only care about who human beings are as individuals. I cannot tell you I'm infallible. I cannot tell you I'm perfect on this. I don't think human beings are. And so, Stephen A., to your question, I think the problem at its core is that human beings are inherently tribal.
I agree, sir, and so are you. So for you to act as if you're a pure individualist, you're being disingenuous once again.
We just are. We are on very, very, very superficial and broad-ranging characteristics.
Let me say this also. Tribalism is a strength as long as you have a strong culture. Our people here in quote-unquote America, the so-called Western blacks or the so-called people of color of the Western hemisphere, so-called Aboriginal blacks, whatever term you want to use. The problem with our level of tribalism is that it's flimsy, it's weak, because our culture is not strong. One of the main reasons why our culture is not strong is because it's become matriarchal. The Luciferian/liberal black woman has been given far too much power. Way, way, way too much power. And she has no idea what she's doing, but she's addicted to power. She's drunk with power. So she has to play multiple angles. She has to play the racialist angle. She has to play the globalist angle. And foremost, she plays the feminist angle. But she's disingenuous for the most part in regards to how she prepares her children, because she's not equipped to fully prepare her children, because the woman by nature was not raised to be a teacher to older people. She can teach the children, but not grown men. She cannot teach teenagers. That's why teenagers rebel in these matriarchal households, because there's no man there. So once again, that's the main issue that we have to solve, brothers.
From sex, gender, race, and we have to do our best to overcome those tribal natures. To me, the answer...
Tribal natures will never be overcome. Once again, we're all going to be tribal to a degree. It's just that the tribal aspect that you embody has to be based in strength. It has to be based in a strong culture. If your tribal aspect is based in a weak culture, like we currently have in the so-called black community, you're going to be weak. When you look at the Asians, they're extremely tribal, but they're very successful because their level of tribal affinity is based in something of substance. Same with the Caucasian Jews, same with the Arabs, same with the East Indians, etc.
The cure that I've sought out by design is to look at people as individuals, as a man. When I see you, Stephen A., I see a man. When you say to me, I speak as a black man, I often don't want to hear you speak that way because I want to hear you as Stephen A. Smith, who grew up in Hollis, Queens, who is a man, who has a point of view, who doesn't adhere to an agenda, who doesn't require groupthink. I think of you in all the best that I can, nuanced in complex ways, that Stephen A. Smith is a man. That's the goal. So when you ask me, how can we do better, and I'll wrap this up, Stephen A., how can we do better? My answer is, for all of us, white Americans, black Americans, to do our best to see each other as individuals.
Well, my response...
Well, let me say this before Stephen A. Smith answers, because Will Kane, of course, he's claiming that his platform is individuality, and that was the best way for him to answer, because that was the best way for him to project his level of idealism. The fact of the matter is that, once again, people are tribal by nature, as is he. It's just that he knows that he cannot come on television and claim that he has a close affinity to his quote-unquote whiteness or what have you. Because the average Caucasian in America has been made to feel embarrassed about having any level of pride in their quote-unquote whiteness on television. Of course, they have plenty of it in private, but they're not allowed to say it for the most part on television because they're getting guilt-tripped by the Caucasian Jew, because the Caucasian Jew understands that the power that they have is constantly trying to foment this level of antipathy between the so-called black man and the so-called white man here in America. Please understand that, once again, these terms black and white are corporate terms. These are terms that were concocted by international bankers and put forth into these governments to put on the people. Why is that? Because you're nothing but a financial asset. I also am against Stephen A. Smith using terms like, I speak as a black man, because, dude, you're not qualified to speak for an entire race of people. You don't understand enough about what our people are dealing with and what the solution is for you to speak on that level. Once again, the main thing that the so-called black man must do is return back to putting the Most High first and stop idolizing a lot of these false gods like what? The woman, like money, like athletes, people who have been bought and paid for. These are the main sources of the problems in the so-called black community. And I say this all the time. The woman in general is beautiful. The black woman is beautiful. Women, period, are beautiful, but they cannot be put on a pedestal at all, because the woman is an agent of chaos. She will seek out any form of entropy that she can because she indulges in it. She loves confusion, and you have to be there as that stabilizing force in the mind and the spirit of the woman. You just have to. That's the first false god that the so-called black man has to conquer. In the process of conquering that, you're also going to conquer, or have to conquer, the image of the Caucasian man as this arbiter, this grand judge that you feel like is going to liberate you or free you from your quote-unquote bondage. The bondage that the so-called black man has is in his mind, and it is in his spirit as well. All right? As a matter of fact, starting with his spirit. When you turn back to the Most High and understand that the Most High called you and chose you to be the king of this earth, to be the king on this planet, a lot of your problems will go away. There's a reason why the other races look to the so-called black man for inspiration on how to live their life to a certain degree. You have to think to yourself, wow, we're at the very bottom in this society, and still the other races look to us for inspiration. Why is that? Imagine if we were on top, how they would look at us. They already look at us as proverbial gods as it is. It's just they're ashamed to admit it. They're embarrassed to admit it because of the constant propaganda on television. But imagine if we were actually the shot callers. Wow. They literally bow down to us as we walk past them. Something to think about.
Response to that is, first of all, I applaud your response. I completely agree with you as to what the cure is in terms of individualism.
Well, that's not really the cure. Individualism is actually going into Luciferianism. That's why you'll notice many of these prominent people on television, these entertainers, when you look at their Twitter handle or something like that, they'll say, I am this, or I am that, I am Stephen A. Smith, I am Max Kellerman. They're telling you that they're Masons, they're Luciferians. Because that term I am is an allusion to what the Most High calls himself. In other words, I am my own God. That is very, very, very prominent in the entertainment industry, Luciferianism / Masonry. And it delves from that mentality of individualism. Now, you do have to assess people individually, but you also have to understand that people that have a common culture, they tend to have a common bent. So that does have to be in the back of your mind. Our people, because our culture is so weak, we're always looking to other races, other cultures to accept us. It's a major problem.
I totally agree with that. I was raised to judge people as individuals, not be tribal, as you so eloquently put it. But
mostly by your mother, I'm sure you were raised that way.
But you did also make sure to recognize the fact that inherently we are tribal.
Yes.
And as a result, because as people, black, white, Hispanic, whatever the case may be, because we are...
Those are all corporate terms, by the way. Black, white, Hispanic. Those are not races. They do not denote origin in any way. They do not denote culture or history or landmass in any way. Those terms, Hispanic, white, black, Asian, African, those are not real terms.
Tribal, we run across those issues and we run across the challenges that those issues present. Here's where the problem lies, where I think a Will Kane is sort of lost in it all, and maybe on purpose, because again, as an individualist, you don't want to entertain those kind of things. Even though you recognize its realness, the authenticity that comes along with it, you really don't want to deal with it because you know, Will, that there's a negative connotation that comes with it. It brings us down when we engage in tribalism and we don't judge each individual by the content of their character. And in your world...
Well, tribalism was also set up to be a defense mechanism. It was a way for you to protect yourself in the same way when we evaluate the animal kingdom. What is one of the main reasons why the lion is considered the king of the big cat world? Because the lion is the only big cat that moves in a unit as a pack. The tiger travels by itself. The leopard travels by itself. The jaguar travels by itself. It's a reason why the lion reigns supreme, because he has a pride. So that's what makes him the strongest in the big cat world. And proverbially speaking, the king of the beasts, the only other animal in the predator world that really can conflict with the lion in regards to majesty is what? The wolf, because the wolf also moves in a pack. So tribes were set up even in the animal kingdom to show preeminence, to show solidarity as a defense mechanism. So so-called black people should not shy away from that. The real issue is that we have to strengthen our tribe with the reinvigoration of a proper culture. Where does that lie? It lies in the scriptures. It lies in the understanding of the Most High. That's where that lies.
That might be an act of futility. So you don't want to be a part of that, and I respect that. The problem with it is that what Black America is trying to tell you, what it may not have to tell Max as much, but will choose to anyway, and any white individual, is that as black people, we have to deal with it no matter what. Because when we're treated, it's always from a tribal context. We are generalized and stereotyped and stigmatized consistently. Driving while black, gangster mentality. I've got passion, I'm angry. A white person has passion. They're just passionate. They care about their job.
All of what Stephen A. Smith is saying right now is relatively pertinent. But one of the main reasons why we have these issues, i.e. driving while black, or these problems in the workplace or in the school system, once again, this system was not set up for us. So we keep trying to force our way into this system. I guarantee you, the Caucasian man that you want to be so concerned about you would show far more concern if he saw that our people were starting to unplug from this system than showing so much willingness to plug into this system. Once again, to use the pimp analogy, if the pimp saw that his prostitute, his number one hoe, his bottom bitch was not showing up for work every day, he said, what the hell's going on? But if the bottom bitch is dutifully on her corner every day, and all she does is complain about what she does, the pimp ain't gonna worry too much about her because he knows that he still has her hook, line, and sinker. Our people have to show that they're unplugging from this society spiritually and mentally if they're truly concerned about getting respect from others. And the main thing that we have to do also, we have to let go of that criminality culture that we embrace to a certain degree. We complain about the Caucasian and other nations or other races trying to project us as criminals, but we've done a very poor job of trying to separate ourselves from that criminal culture. We tend to make excuses for that culture. We tend to say, well, they were just trying to get by. They were doing what they had to do. No, there are always other avenues for you to be a productive person and be a functional person, even when you're struggling. If you look hard enough, if you plan better. We have to plan better. One of the ways that we plan better is making sure that we have a stronger household. How do we make sure that we have a stronger household? So-called black man. Scrutinize who you inseminate. That's where it all starts. That's why I always go back to that theme.
I'm screaming A. Smith. Why does he have a job? Mad Dog Russo got his own damn channel and nobody complains. And he screams more than me. And you know I love my brother Mad Dog Russo.
Well, you know what? People talk about Mad Dog Russo screaming a lot as well. And then Stephen A. Smith, he's almost like the sports commentator version of a LeBron James. He's an almost world famous, certainly nationwide famous figure in the sports commentating world. He's the #1 sports analyst at ESPN. So for him to be constantly complaining about how he's depicted or how he's treated, that's what happens when you get to the mountaintop. People are going to scrutinize you. I guarantee you Stephen A. Smith makes more money than Max Kellerman and Will Cain. Might make more money than the both of them combined. And if he isn't, he needs to go speak to the bosses up at ESPN because he should be. So I have a hard time taking a LeBron James or Stephen A. Smith that seriously when they start to talk about the inadequacies in their chosen field. There are brothers out here who are really struggling. But the main thing that we have to do, we have to start thinking with a little bit more foresight so that we don't end up in as many bad situations. That's why I tell brothers who listen to my channel, you're in high school, something like that, learn a trade. If you don't want to go to college, learn a trade. Try to put yourself in a position. You know that you have a certain talent. You're a great artist, a great writer. Make sure that you try to perfect that talent. Go to school to perfect it. But #1 thing, don't give your soul away just to chase your dream. Make sure that you keep those things intact. But there are avenues out there for you as long as you conduct yourself in an upright way.
My point to you is that the tribalism that you allude to, while I respect what you're saying and completely concur with you about what the goal should be, the reality is that the tribalism or the tribal mentality has worked against the black community historically
Will, go ahead,
continues
and then I'd like to say
work
something.
against
I'd like
us.
to say something.
Well, the tribal mentality really has not worked against the so-called black community per se. Lack of knowledge is what works against the so-called black community. Because you can gang up together with people, but if you don't have a cultural affinity, you're not going to stick together. That's why there's such a lack of loyalty in the so-called black community. And then on top of that, once again, we've embraced that mindset or the subculture of criminality and extolling it. Supposedly, they're quote-unquote keeping it real. So a lot of times, a lot of young cats, they join these gangs or the drug culture. And of course, those people are going to turn on you because that's the subculture of that culture, is to turn on people because it's all about hedonism. Doing what you want, doing what you feel, doing whatever you lust after at that particular moment. So that's a dysfunctional, that's a destructive form of tribalism. Tribalism is good as long as it's based in something substantive. The other races show you that all the time.
Something, Will, when you're
Thank
done.
you, Max. But see what happened here, Stephen A? I feel like we went back to the top. I feel like we went full circle because I don't deny, hold on real quick, I don't deny that the world and America have treated the African American tribally. And of course, I think that is incorrect. But the question you present to me is what can be done about it.
And I agree with you.
Okay, but hold on real quick. And
Well, what can be done about it is that our treatment that we receive is only going to change when you make it change. And again, this is why I lose a lot of so-called pro-blacks, because they're obsessed with the back and forth with the white man. That's why I have these videos that I make where I state that you get what you deserve. You get what you tolerate. Because when you tolerate a certain level of treatment from other races, It's because you feel like you're so disempowered that you have to tolerate it. When we put ourselves in more advantageous positions by showing that we have more self-discipline, they're not going to have the option but to treat us more respectfully, because we're going to start to be able to dictate terms. All life is about is power shift. You have to know how to get power. You get power through discipline. You know how much power you have with the woman when you show that you have discipline? The woman will try to control you through her vagina if you're weak. If you're weak. If she sees that you're a simp, then you're going to be easy to be manipulated. If you're not a simp, then she has to divest power over to you. Power always goes hand in hand with discipline and dedication. It's never going to go by you asking or begging for power. That's not how it works. So our people keep trying to figure out how to get the white man to like them. It's not about getting the so-called white man to like you. It's about accruing power over to yourself. By no longer looking at things from an emotional perspective. It's from a logistical perspective that we have to approach things.
And so when I brought up LeBron's examples earlier, that wasn't to obfuscate. That wasn't to dodge the issue. Because what I think happens is when we use poor examples of how someone is treated tribally and incorrectly, we undercut the greater issue.
I agree with that, sir.
So you have to begin to look at every instance and every individual specifically
I disagree with both of you.
We don't
disagree.
We don't disagree.
Okay, but that's the cure. To me, when you say what can be done,
I disagree with
individuals treat people as individuals.
Go ahead, Max.
I disagree with both of you. We don't live in a post-racial world. It would be nice if we did.
But I didn't say we did.
It's like
we will never ever live in a post-racial world, Max Kellerman. And you know what's so funny about Max Kellerman? He keeps going on these rants about racialism or racism in a post-racial world. Google a picture of Max Kellerman with his wife. His wife is clearly a practicing Jew, someone who adheres to the tenets of Judaism. There's a photo of Max Kellerman walking down the street with his wife with a very, very long dress on. Of course, they're walking with 2 of their children or 3 of their children, whatever it is. And that shows you right there that Max Kellerman also subscribes to the tenets of tribalism and the importance of it. Once again, brothers, the strongest nations on the planet Earth have the strongest level of tribalism, because it's one thing to be tribal, but it's another thing to understand why you're tribal. And that's through a strong cultural affinity. That's the point, and that's what makes it relevant. Of course, Max Kellerman is going to disagree with them both because he has to be the agent of chaos here.
It's like when Hillary Clinton was asked about Black Lives Matter, and she said all lives matter, and that became a problem. And a lot of white people thought, what's wrong with saying all lives matter? On the surface, it makes sense. It's because black lives haven't mattered for 400 years. Right. And you cannot ignore the history. There's a reason that per capita, African Americans earn less money, are less educated, live in areas of greater crime, etc. It's not anything intrinsic about who people are as individuals. It's been systemic injustice that still reverberates, that is still present.
Let me say this very quickly, because Max Kellerman made a series of points, and a lot of them are very valid. Our people come from oftentimes very disadvantaged backgrounds. I've stated this in another video, and it's going to be hard for a lot of people to accept this. But once you become aware and cognizant of what your position is, of what your condition is, the number one person that has to change it is you. A lot of people are not going to like this. They're going to say, oh, you're trying to give the white man a pass. Nigga, I don't have to give the so-called white man a pass. I'm not qualified to give him a pass because he's the one that's in power. You can march and protest and beg and scream and cry all you want. At the end of the day, in order for us to truly be a people that have a certain level of positive pride, real pride, we have to show that we can solve our own problems. And that starts once again with the so-called black man not running around inseminating women willy-nilly. We have to get to know the women that we're dealing with, whether you have one woman or you have 2 wives or 3 wives or 3 concubines. We have to understand who we're dealing with, why we're dealing with them, and to what level we should be interacting with them. That's going to go a great deal in stopping a lot of these bad conditions, because we understand what the reason why crime is promoted in certain neighborhoods is to feed the prison industrial complex, which is a major revenue stream for the U.S. government and for the global economy. So to know better is to do better. Hopefully, that should be the mindset. To know better is to do better. So that is one of the ways that we have to show our ruling class mentality and the notion that we're going to start to take over our own communities by making better decisions. And people might make excuses about that. I know plenty of cats who used to be involved in crime and now run their own businesses. So don't tell me what you can't do. It's about what you want to do. Do you take the time to sit down and write down what your goals are? Do you know what your talents are? Are you willing to be disciplined enough and dedicated enough to bring those talents to light? Or are you just another guy who wants to sit back on the computer all day talking about America and spelling it with 3 Ks and thinking that you're making a difference? I mean, that shit doesn't impress me. America's not made for us. I mean, that's old news. Say something new. Say something powerful. Say something insightful. To just go back to the same old white supremacy, this, white supremacy, that. Well, you say white supremacy so much that you actually start to believe that they're supreme to you. And that's why you keep using that term, because you want the white man to no longer be supreme to you because you feel like he's supreme to you. That's why you guys love to use that term so much, because once again, this is not white supremacy that we're living in. This is white rulership. This is so-called white rulership. This is their time to rule. White supremacy is when they go back in time and they try to change history and try to inject themselves into civilizations that were not Caucasian. But once again, that's another video for another day. I've already covered that, or I've already stated that, or put forth that sentiment in these videos. So our people have to learn how to use terms appropriately, because when you use terms inappropriately, that puts out the wrong sentiment and it causes confusion.
So, to take the individual approach, I agree, individual responsibility is part of it. And whenever this conversation happens, those who bring up individual responsibility are criticized on the left. No, they're institutional issues. Those who bring up the institutional issues are criticized on the right. No, individualism. They're both valid. However, if 400 years of being treated as less than human, if the remedy, in your view, Will, is simply, especially as a lawyer, I imagine, that fairness appeals to you. Everyone's equal under the law, and everyone needs to be treated that way. Even were that true right now, which is in dispute that everyone's treated equally under the law along racial lines, even if that were true, it would not address, and maybe we just philosophically disagree, that it would address the 400 years of injustice.
Well, Max Kellerman, you're creating a conundrum for yourself, because you're basically stating correctly, I might add, that there's no way for so-called white people to provide any form of restitution to so-called blacks based off of the slave narrative that you yourself have postulated. So the only solution is, as I've stated in previous videos in regards to Max Kellerman, go to your bank, take out all of your bank funds, and give them to the first so-called black man that you see. Go into your closet, give away all your clothes to so-called black people. Give away your home to a so-called black person. Tell them you can now live in my home. It's fully paid off, and I'm going to put it in your name. That's the only way for you to provide restitution. And I'm surprised that so many so-called regular Caucasians allow the super liberal Caucasian Jew to push this white guilt on them and to create these stipulations that they themselves will not live by. Max Kellerman will never, ever live by any of these stipulations that he himself is putting forth right now. Because as he himself has said, there's literally no way for the so-called Caucasian to provide restitution based off of the slave narrative. There's no way. He'd have to empty his bank account. So Max Kellerman, you have to be the first one. Set the trend. Be the first one to do it.
I get where you're coming from. I'm just going to leave it at this. The question that Stephen A. has asked is what can be done about it? And I believe, by the way, where we are in the United States of America right now, and I believe that identity politics is at its highest. And we're defined ourselves by groups. We've defined ourselves by superficial characteristics that define our groups. And
no, sir, identity politics is not at its highest. Not at all. As a matter of fact, it's the same politics that have been utilized in America since its inception. It's just that Donald Trump is not as good an actor as previous presidents have been, and he's not as plugged in as other presidents have been. But he's the same person. Anybody who thinks that Donald Trump is any more or less racist than Ronald Reagan or the Bushes or Bill Clinton or Joe Ford or whoever is fooling themselves. It's just that he's far more transparent. And there's a reason why, when you look at many of these presidents, they have a a background in entertainment or acting, because it's their job to basically lead the people of America along as actors, as ambassadors for the overall corporate structure of the international bankers. That's their job. Their job is just to make the American people feel comfortable one way or the other, but it's just two horns on the same devil. That's all the Democrat-Republican layout is.
And I'm not rejecting history, and I'm certainly not suggesting we live in a post-racial world. But if we want to ask what can be done about it, the truth of the matter is, if you think you can fix it by reinforcing group identities, what can white America do? What can white America do to help black America do? I think you will entrench the opposition to the eventual cure, which is look at human beings as individuals.
Yep.
I think the bottom line is Max is right on the money with what he's saying from an historical perspective, but Will is right on the money in terms of talking about what the end goal, at the end of the day, what we should all hope.
Well, that's the problem, sir. All your rhetoric is always predicated around hope as opposed to reality. The reason why everything that you're saying has to revolve around the concept, the nebulous concept of humanistic hope, is because you're hoping once again to push forth this ideology that one day everybody's going to think the same, and they're not. The important thing for the so-called black man to understand is that we have to create our own conventionalities of hope by putting ourselves in better positions, by making better decisions. That doesn't mean that our lives are going to be fully fruitful or exactly how we want them to be, but at least it will stop us from getting involved in a lot of these silly situations. I have a relative who is a lawyer, and she told me that when she was in law school that her law professor told her that 85% of men are locked up over women. And I didn't need her to tell me that to already know that. I told her that for years before she went to law school. But oftentimes when you say things just based off of a three-dimensional level of thinking, it does not resonate with people until they're told things by a so-called accredited professor or someone who is knee-deep in the system. But anybody who pays attention can see that a lot of these men put themselves in disadvantageous positions over women. And that's not necessarily to blame the woman, because the man is supposed to know better. But when you listen to the women, or when you listen to the woman per se on serious matters, you start to think like a woman, you start to act like a woman, you start to lead with your emotions. And that leads you into making bad decisions. These are the things that we have to address before we start talking about the hope that everyone's going to think the same as us. That's never going to happen. Those are Luciferian ideologies. That's a romanticization of real life. And you can romanticize things all day long. At the end of the day, things are always going to return back to how they're supposed to be, no matter how high the tidal waves, roar and all these other things. When the sea returns to its natural level, its natural state, it's always going to be about what are your decisions, what is your decision-making process? And that's it. None of us are going to be perfect, but at least if you make a habit of making better decisions, you're going to keep yourself out of a bad situation.
The point that we get to.
And how you get there.
I 100% agree. I just think we're so far from individualism at that point. It's an unrealistic goal right now.
Thank you, Molly Karam. Even you understand that. You understand that everyone looking at every other person as an individual is an unrealistic goal, because it's all predicated on how strong your culture is. East Indians, Arabs, Asians, they're not concerned about being viewed individualistically because they know that they have a strong backbone of a culture. Our people, so-called blacks, the reason why we have to push this individualistic mentality is because our culture is non-existent. It's just a reality. It's non-existent. Certain people might get mad at that. It's the truth.
Put yourself further back.
Let's just not be more devoted to order than justice, as Martin Luther King said. Not a negative piece of order, but a positive piece of justice.
Well, the reason why Martin Luther King said that, and the reason why you reiterate that, is because you're not concerned with order. You're concerned with chaos. In your view, you get justice from promoting chaos. Then you can create your own quote-unquote order. That's what the Hegelian dialectic is all about. So once again, always pay attention to what the superliberal Caucasian, or specifically the superliberal Caucasian Jew, has to say. Because when you listen to what they have to say, then you know where many of these so-called black activists get their thoughts from.
Black justice and black people, that's what black people have been talking about for centuries, and we'll never stop talking about that.
Well said.
Well, I agree with that. A lot of you low-level, so-called woke blacks, you're never going to stop talking, period. But your talking is not going to change anything because you're not thinking on a deep enough level. But that's okay. A lot of you guys are going to be forced to acknowledge what the truth is soon enough.
Well said. So appreciate all of you and this conversation.
Thank you.
But anyway, that's basically it on that. I'm not even sure if they spent much time in this second segment even speaking about LeBron James. But it was a decent conversation nonetheless. So peace.